During a recent home cell group session, one of the members expressed being haunted by cutting back on the tithes due to economic reasons. Her situation is not unique. All of us probably have questions around tithing. Do we really understand the principles, and is it still valid today? How do we navigate this tricky intersection of faith and finance? I've put together a 15-minute Bible study on the history of tithing and its place under the new covenant. I've learned a lot from this time in Scripture, and I'm sure it will benefit you as well.
Today, we're jumping into one of the most debated topics in faith communities, tithing. You know, it's right at that tricky intersection of faith and finances, and honestly, for a lot of people, it brings up way more questions than answers. Are we supposed to do it? How much? What does the Bible actually say? And the questions start with the really practical stuff, right? Which, just shows how confusing it all is. How does this ancient practice even work with a modern paycheck? And that uncertainty, well, it's the source of a lot of tension for people. For many, though, tithing isn't just some vague suggestion. It is a core act of their faith. I mean, it's the very first bill they pay, a total non-negotiable. For them, it's a powerful way to show trust and obedience. But then you have this other perspective, and it's growing, that says the whole idea of a mandatory 10% to a church is a complete misreading of the scriptures. They see it as an old law that just doesn't apply anymore. Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, we need to follow the story of the tithe from the very beginning. We'll start with the dilemma we're all facing today, then go back to its mysterious origins, see how it became a national tax, uncover a huge change in the law, and finally, explore what came next. So yeah, all these conflicting views really bring us to the central problem, the one question that's fueling this whole conversation. Is tithing a compulsory act for believers today? All right, you ready? Let's dive in. To really get our heads around this, we've got to follow the thread of tithing through the entire Bible, all the way from the very first time it pops up, through the Old Law, and see what it means for us today in the New Covenant. So let's rewind. Our story actually starts way before Moses ever went up the mountain. In fact, the first time a tithe is ever mentioned happens centuries before the law of Moses was even a thing. You can find this story way back in Genesis 14. After winning this huge battle, Abram, who we later know as Abraham, runs into this mysterious priest king named Melchizedek. And as a way to honor him, Abram gives him a tenth of everything he won in the war. And here's the key thing to notice. This was a one-time thing. It was totally voluntary, and it wasn't from his paycheck, right? It was from the plunder of battle. Okay, now let's see how this very personal, kind of ambiguous act turned into something much more structured, much more official under the law of Moses. Hundreds of years after Abram, tithing isn't a spontaneous gift anymore. It gets written into the law for the entire nation of Israel. It became this really detailed system of taxation, designed to support the religious and social fabric of their whole society. Now this is where it gets really fascinating. The Old Testament law didn't just command one 10% tithe. It actually lays out three separate tithes. You had the Levitical tithe, which supported the priests. Then there was a festival tithe to pay for national religious celebrations. And finally, a poor tithe, collected every third year, which basically worked like a social welfare program. And this is the part that so many people miss. When you actually add it all up, the annual requirement for an ancient Israelite wasn't 10%, not even close. It was actually more like 23% of everything they produced from their land and animals. It was a national tax system. And that brings us to maybe the most quoted and, let's be honest, often misused passage about tithing anywhere, Malachi 3. See, this was written to the priests of Israel who were failing at their job. So in that specific context, the promise to open the floodgates of heaven wasn't some metaphor for getting rich. It was a super literal promise of rain for their farms. The blessing and the curse were directly tied to that old covenant system. And this, right here, is the absolute game changer for Christians. The central message of the New Testament is that Jesus fulfilled the entire law. He took that curse of the law on himself, which sets believers completely free from that old system of obligation and all its consequences. But this whole system, the priests, the nation it was for, was all part of the old covenant. That was the specific agreement God had with the nation of Israel. And that brings us to the biggest turning point in this whole story. The New Testament book of Hebrews makes this huge theological point. It says that with Jesus, the priesthood itself changed. And if the priesthood changes, then the law that was connected to that priesthood, well, it has to change too. This is a massive shift. The focus moves completely away from an external role, a required percentage, to the internal heart of the person giving, driven by a totally new reason. So the bottom line of this argument is this: the New Testament never repeats the command for believers to tithe. That specific rule, tied to that old Levitical system, is seen as being finished, fulfilled, along with the Old Covenant itself. So this leads to a really obvious question, right? It's the mandatory legal requirement to tithe is gone. What takes its place? Is it just a free-for-all now?
We want to get to the heart of what changes the giver.
That's the key, isn't it? The shift we're after. Because our sources, they don't just tell you what to give. They seem to redefine what it even means to have resources in the first place.
Right. The goal is to get to a place where you see everything, your time, your talent, your money, as something you're managing, not something you own.
It's a complete shift in perspective.
It is. Once you embrace that identity of a steward, a manager of God's resources for his kingdom, then, well, every financial decision starts to look different.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the foundation of New Testament giving, which seems to be all about the heart.
It is.
But just to give some context, when we say we're moving away from Old Testament ideas, what is that fundamental difference we see in the New Covenant when it comes to money?
The difference is radical freedom. The Old Covenant had specific duties. Tithing, for instance, was a legal requirement for Israel.
Flat tax, basically.
In a way, yeah. But the New Covenant, which is founded on grace, it asks for something much deeper than just compliance. It asks for the whole person, a willingness of the heart. The actual amount is almost secondary to the motivation.
And Jesus connects our money to our motivations so directly, it's almost impossible to ignore that teaching.
Oh, the one from Matthew. For where your treasure is.
Your heart will be also.
Exactly. Why that specific link? It feels so tight.
Well, because our financial decisions are probably the clearest, most honest metric of what we're actually devoted to. We're always making these little trade-offs, between worldly security and actual reliance on God. So you're saying if you want a spiritual EKG, just look at someone's bank statement.
Or their calendar. It's that simple. Money isn't neutral. It's deeply spiritual because it governs our anxiety, our ambition, where we put our focus.
That makes a lot of sense. And the sources point out that generosity isn't just, a good habit. It's supposed to reflect God's actual character.
Absolutely. Generosity is theological before it's practical. James writes that God is the source of every good and perfect gift.
Right.
So our own giving is meant to be a small mirror of his nature as this infinitely generous Father. If we're clutching our resources tightly, we're kind of acting contrary to the very nature of the God we say we follow.
But the motivation goes even deeper than just mirroring God. It's rooted in redemption, isn't it? What's the real engine for that kind of radical generosity?
What's fascinating here is the ultimate engine is recognizing Christ's sacrifice. Paul just boils it all down in one sentence. He reminds the church that Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich.
That's the ultimate exchange.
It is. And when you really internalize that everything good you have is already a gift that was bought by this profound sacrifice giving, stops feeling coerced.
Yeah.
It just becomes natural.
So that shift from compulsion to gratitude, that takes us right into the principles of New Covenant giving. If love is the why, then how do you actually do it?
The first principle is that freedom of the heart we talked about,
Right.
the why. Paul puts it so beautifully to the Corinthians. Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion.
For God loves a cheerful giver. I love that phrase, cheerful giver.
And the answer is that freedom of the heart isn't a license for selfishness. It's an opportunity for spiritual growth.
Yeah.
A truly cheerful giver is already operating from that place of stewardship. They already recognize God's ownership. So if a heart is really surrendered, the decision it makes will naturally reflect proportional love, not selfish hoarding.
Right, that connects to something else one of the sources mentioned, that giving out of manipulation or fear actually voids the return. What does that mean?
The consequences are spiritual. God is looking at the heart. So if you give because you feel guilty or ashamed, or you think you can kind of force God's hand like he's a slot machine, as one source put it.
Pull the lever, get a blessing.
Exactly. You missed the whole point. The blessing isn't in the transaction itself. It's in how the act of giving transforms you into a more trusting, generous person. If the attitude's wrong, the action is hollow.
Okay, so the why is clear. It has to be cheerful, voluntary. What about the how? We often think spontaneous giving is the most heartfelt, but the New Testament seems to suggest planning.
It really does. Paul was very practical. He told the Corinthian believers, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income.
So it's intentional.
It's intentional, it's regular, and it's proportional. Generosity isn't supposed to be the leftover change at the end of the month. It should be a planned, first fruits kind of decision.
That brings us to proportionality. The idea that giving is based on what a person has, not what they don't have. So the more you have, the more you're expected to give.
Right.
Doesn't that start to feel like a new kind of legalism, even if the percentage isn't fixed?
It can feel that way, but only if you forget you're a steward. If God has entrusted you with more resources, then your responsibility and your opportunity grows. It's not a burden, it's a bigger chance to participate.
And the story that just nails this is the widow's mite.
Oh, it's the perfect illustration. You have these wealthy people making a big show of dropping large sums into the treasury.
Right.
And then this poor widow comes and puts in 2 tiny copper coins.
And Jesus singles her out. Why? It wasn't the amount.
Not at all. He praised her because she gave a greater percentage. In fact, she gave everything she had to live on. It wasn't about the number. It was about her total heart commitment, this radical trust in God to provide for her. And that is the ultimate currency.
That idea of radical trust, it leads right to the question everyone has on their mind. What's the return? Let's talk about sowing and reaping.
Yes, and this is probably the most misunderstood part of the whole conversation.
How so?
Giving is compared to farming. It requires patience, it requires faith. Like one pastor said, God is not a slot machine. You don't just pull a lever and get an instant jackpot.
You plant in one season,
and you reap in another. It's about growth over time, not an immediate transaction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the sources promise an almost unbelievable return on this investment. The language is just extravagant.
It is.
Jesus says, give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your lap. That just sounds like an overflowing basket.
It's a promise of abundance. And it's important to remember it's not just about money. The promise is that generous people will prosper. But the most profound idea comes from Proverbs. Being generous to the poor is like lending to the Lord.
Lending to the Lord, that's a bold statement.
It is. And the promise is that He will pay you back, often with great interest. You're essentially elevating your generosity to the most secure investment imaginable. God Himself is the guarantor of the return.
Wow.
And the promises get even more specific. Paul tells the Philippians that if we prioritize giving, God will meet all of our needs from His own glorious riches. It's a relationship of trust. You release what you're managing for His purposes, and He makes sure you have everything you need.
That perspective shift from scarcity to absolute security, you really see it play out in the early Christian communities, especially when they were facing hardship.
This is where the story of the Macedonian churches in 2 Corinthians is just so inspiring. I mean, Paul says they were going through a most severe trial. They were in extreme poverty.
Which is when you'd think the natural instinct is to hold on to every last penny, to protect yourself.
Right. But they did the exact opposite. Their deep poverty actually welled up in rich generosity.
That's completely counterintuitive.
And Paul says they gave beyond their ability. But here's the most powerful part. They urgently pleaded with him for the privilege of sharing in the offering for the other saints.
They begged to give money away.
They begged. For them, generosity wasn't a duty, it was a privilege, a way to participate in God's grace.
And who was on the receiving end of this? It wasn't just about propping up the local church building.
No, the giving was very outward focused. It was directed to the real needs of others, supporting the poor, widows, orphans. James calls that pure and faultless religion. But it was also for supporting those who minister the gospel. Paul's argument was simple. The laborer is worthy of his reward.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate goal of all this generosity isn't just to keep the church afloat, it's what? To convince the world.
Precisely. Generosity is what makes Christ's love visible and tangible. When a community, especially one that doesn't have much itself, is willing to share freely and joyfully, it says something powerful to a world that's consumed by, self-interest and materialism. It's proof that this faith community really does reflect the self-giving nature of Jesus.
So what does this all mean?
Yeah.
Our deep dive shows that New Testament generosity, it demands a willing heart. It's all modeled on Christ's sacrifice. It requires planning and proportionality, and it's aimed at building God's kingdom and caring for people. The whole focus shifts from, say, legalistic compliance to joyful, willing participation.
And we've established that stewardship is about managing everything, time, talent, and treasure for God's purposes. But I think the biggest insight is that this whole practice fundamentally transforms the giver. It frees you from the anxiety of ownership and the trap of materialism.
Right.
We talked about that measure, that the way you give is the way it will be given back to you. So here's the final thought to mull over. If true, heartfelt generosity requires proportional giving, not just a fixed number, how do you measure your own prosperity today? And are you giving at a level that truly reflects a radical trust in God, even when, maybe especially when, that decision feels uncomfortable?
We are called to first seek God's kingdom and His righteousness. How is this reflected in your stewardship? I pray that you may find the wisdom to be a good steward. Until next time.